Welcome back. In this section, let's start with learning Spring Boot. What do we want to do in this specific section? We want to build a Hello World app in the modern Spring Boot approach. And we would want to get hands-on with Spring Boot and learn some of the most important Spring Boot concepts. We want to understand, why do we need Spring Boot? How does Spring Boot make it easy to develop Spring-based applications? How does Spring Boot makes it easy to develop microservices? We want to understand the terminology with Spring Boot as well. Spring Initializer, auto configuration, starter projects, Actuator, developer tools. There are a lot of terminology which is associated with the Spring framework. Let's try and get hands-on and understand all that terminology in this specific section. Are you excited to learn Spring Boot? I'll see you in the next step. Welcome back. Let's get started with creating a simple Spring Boot project. How do we create Spring Boot projects? The easiest way to create Spring Boot projects is to use the website Spring Initializer. You can create a variety of Spring projects using Spring Initializer website. You can go in here. I would recommend you to choose all the defaults, Maven, Java, and I would recommend you to use the latest released version of Spring Boot. I would recommend not to use any of the snapshot or milestone releases. A milestone release is identified by M1, M2 or M3. Do not use them. Over here I can see the latest release is 2.4.4. There is another release which is present 2.3.9, but this is old. So I would recommend you to choose the latest released version. By the time you watch this video, if you'd see 2.5 or 2.6 or 2.7, choose the latest version which does not have either snapshot or M3 associated with it. And I would go in and give group ID and artifact ID. Group ID and artifact ID are the names that we would give to our project. This is like the package and the class name. So com.in28minutes is the group. Artifact ID I would give learn Spring Boot. I would choose the defaults for the rest of the things. And I would add a dependency. We would want to build a simple REST API. And in Spring Boot, the way you can build REST API is by using Spring Web. So if you type in web, you can choose Spring Web. As you can read in here, it says build web, including RESTful applications using Spring MVC. This uses Apache Tomcat as the default embedded container. So we would want to build applications using Spring MVC and run them on Tomcat as the embedded server. So we will choose Spring Web. I'll click this and choose it. And you can see that Spring Web is added in here. Now you can go in and click generate. This would create a zip file and this would be downloaded to your downloads folder. What I would recommend you to do is to unzip that zip file. And you can move the unzipped file to some folder on your hard disk. You can open up a new workspace in Eclipse, or you can use an existing workspace that you are already using. What I would do in here is to import it as a Maven project file, import existing Maven projects, and over here I can choose the folder where you extracted the zip file to. I've extracted it to this folder and I would say open. And you can see a pom.xml in here. That's cool. You can go ahead and say finish. You'd see that within a little while, the project would be configured for you. If you are having any problems with the import, what I would recommend you to do is to make sure that you have the latest version of Eclipse installed. There are multiple Eclipse releases which are released every year. So make sure that you are using the latest Eclipse version, and most of the times you should not face a problem. Now you should see source main Java. This is where we would write our Java code. Source main resources. This is where we would have our application configuration present. And we would have source test Java where we will write our unit tests. If you go to Maven dependencies, you'd see that there are a number of Maven dependencies which are added in. These are added in because in our pom.xml, we have a few dependencies defined. So you can see that we want to develop a web application. That's why we added in Spring Boot Starter Web. So Spring Boot Starter Web is something called a starter, which is provided by Spring Boot to help you build web applications. And because we added in Spring Boot Starter Web, you would see that there are a lot of dependencies which are present in here. We would look into all these in detail a little later. All that we need to do right now is go in source main Java, open up Learn Spring Boot application class, and right click, run as Java application. This would take a little while to launch up the Java application. And within a minute or so, you should see that a new Spring Boot application is launched up for you. In this step, we created a simple Spring Boot project using Spring Initializer, and we were able to quickly launch it up as well. In the next steps, let's start building some functionality. Let's build a few features and use those features to understand Spring Boot framework. Welcome back. Starting this step, let's get hands-on with Spring Boot. To understand the power of Spring Boot, we'll build a very simple REST API. Expose a URL, something like this. If user sends a request to this URL, what we want to do is we want to be able to respond back with a simple response back. Let's get started. I'll go in here, and what we want to do is to create a controller. So I'll say new class, and I would put it in package.courses.controller. So it would be related to courses and it would be a controller. That's why I put it in a package called courses.controller, and I'll call this course controller. And I would say finish. We'd want to expose a web URL. How can we do that? We would want to expose a simple REST API. How can we do that? So I can say this is a REST controller. So add REST controller, and you can do an organize imports. This would import org Spring Framework web bind annotation REST controller. That looks cool. Now what we want to do, when user types in this URL, we want to send a specific response back. So when user sends a request, typically the default request which is sent by users is something called a GET. And we would want to create a GET mapping. What is the URI / courses? This is what the user would send. This is what the user would send a request to. And what we want to do when user sends a request to this, I would need to return a response back. I'll return a list of courses back. So list of course. We don't have the course class yet. We'll build that very soon. I'll call this get all courses. And over here, what we need to do is to return a list of courses. Return arrays.asList. If you're using Java 9 or higher, you can also use list.off. And we would want to build a new course. So the new course that we would want to create, what do we want to be able to do in there? We would want to give it a ID. So ID is 1. Let's say the ID is 1. And we would want to have a name for the course. So let's pick it up from here, or you can type it in. I want to be able to learn microservices. And we would want the author in 28 minutes. So that's the course we would want to create and return back. Right now, there are a lot of compilation errors. We typed in the code. Let's fix the compilation errors. The first thing I would do is organize imports. You need to choose Java util list. So get mapping is imported in org Spring Framework web bind annotation get mapping, and the other thing which would have been imported in is Java util list. There are compilation errors on the course class, obviously, right? We did not create the course class yet. So what I would do is go in here and press Command 1. So I'll say create class course, and I'll create this in courses.bean package. So com in 28 minutes learn Spring Boot, courses bean is the package, course is the bean name. Let's go ahead and say finish. So this is the course class that we would want to create. And what do we want to do in the course class? We would want to have 3 fields: ID, name, and author. Let's go ahead and create them. private long ID, private string name, and private string author. So these are the three fields that we would want. And let's do a right click, source generate, and you'd be able to go ahead and generate, okay? And you'd be able to go ahead and generate a constructor using fields. So let's generate a constructor using all the three fields. So we have a constructor which is generated right now. Let's also generate a toString method. So I click source generate and say generate toString. And let's use the defaults and create a toString method as well. So this would help us to see the details if you'd want to print it to the console. So we now have a course class created and we would want to use this. So if you save the controller right now, you'd see that it would compile properly. If you have a compilation error, then make sure that the order is matching whatever you have in the constructor. So ID, name, and author. Over here as well, I have ID, name, and author. So it all looks good. And last thing that I would need to do in the course class before I would be able to run the application is to generate a little bit more code. So you need to generate source, generate getters and setters. Let's generate only getters. So select getters and let's generate the getters for this specific class. So you can see that get ID, get name, and get author are generated. Let's do a format of the class. And it looks good right now. So we have a course class with a constructor, getters, and the toString method defined. What we'll do is go ahead, stop the application, and let's start it again. Cool, the application started up fine. Let's go in and type in the URL localhost 8080/courses. Fingers crossed, will it work? Cool. You'd see that I'm able to launch this app. You can see the response which is coming back. ID 1, learn microservices in 28 minutes. You might see simple text. So if you say view source, this is what you would be seeing. However, I have a Chrome extension called JSON Viewer, which is installed. And because of the extension, I can see the response back in a formatted way. I can see ID is 1, name is learn microservices, and author is in 28 minutes. The idea behind this step is to start understanding the power of Spring Boot with a simple example. You can see that within 10 minutes, we were able to create a Hello World REST API very easily. That's what Spring Boot enables. To understand the power of Spring Boot, let's try and understand how applications were built before Spring Boot in the next step. I'll see you in the next step. Welcome back. In this step, let's look at how you would have built the same application before the evolution of Spring Boot. Let's say you would want to build a simple application using Spring Framework, Spring MVC, and you'd want to run it on Tomcat. I've made a link available to a sample pom.xml from our earlier course on Spring MVC. You'd see that there are a lot of things that are defined in our pom.xml. Setting up Spring Web projects before Spring Boot was not easy. You need to define all the maven dependencies and manage versions of framework. If you open up this link, as you can see in here in the pom.xml, you have to define the dependencies and you have to define the versions of the dependencies. You can see that the versions keep changing. If you want to move from one version of Spring to another version of Spring, you need to make multiple changes in here. So you need to manage maven dependencies and the versions for frameworks. You'd also need to define web.xml file for your web application. So if you go to web.xml, if you search for web.xml, you'd see that there is a web.xml in here where a simple servlet is configured. You can see the complex configuration which is involved in configuring something called a dispatcher servlet. So you need to configure that. And after that, you need to define a Spring context XML where you define all your beans. You need to create something like to-do servlet.xml and define component scan and a lot of things in there. So you'd need to go in and let's go. If you scroll up a little, you'd see to-do servlet.xml, where we have a component scan defined and a lot of other things defined in here as well. Other than that, you'd also need to install Tomcat, or you need to configure something called a Tomcat 7 Maven plugin. You'd see the configuration for that in the pom.xml over here. So you can see that we need to configure a Tomcat 7 Maven plugin. And after that, you need to build your application and you need to run the application in Tomcat. As you see in the last step, running applications with Spring Boot is very, very easy. All that we did was we went to Spring Initializer, we created a simple project, and we saw that this project also contained just a couple of files. Not a lot of complexity in that specific project as such. And we were able to quickly run the application. And we also saw, if you look at the logs, that this is making use of Tomcat as well. So there is a lot of magic that Spring Boot brings in. Spring Boot makes it really, really easy to build web applications or REST API or any kind of Java applications that you'd want to build. Now that we saw the magic of Spring Boot, let's understand what's happening beneath the hood. How does Spring Boot do its magic? There are two important things that you need to understand, which are Spring Boot starter projects and Spring Boot auto configuration. Let's get started with understanding Spring Boot starter projects in the next step. Welcome back. In this step, let's get started with understanding Spring Boot starter projects. Spring Boot starter projects are one of the fundamental blocks behind the magic of Spring Boot. The goal of starter projects is to help you get a project up and running quickly. If you'd want to develop a web application, the starter you would make use of is Spring Boot Starter Web. Earlier, when we created this project on the Spring Initializer page, we chose Spring Web. This is the Spring Boot Starter Web that we chose. And if you open up the pom.xml, so let's go in and open up the pom.xml file in here, you'd see that there is a dependency on Spring Boot Starter Web. So if you want to develop a web application with Spring Boot, or if you want to develop a REST API with Spring Boot, the recommended starter is Spring Boot Starter Web. Now, what is the magic of this Spring Boot Starter Web? You can do a control click or a command click and open pom.xml for org Spring Framework boot Spring Boot Starter Web. If you click that, another pom.xml opens up where you would see that there are a number of dependencies which are defined in here. Whenever you build a web application, you'd want to be able to use JSON. You'd want to be able to convert the bean. If you look at this course controller, what we are doing in here, we are returning a list back. How is the list getting converted to JSON? If you look at the response that came back, it's a JSON response. How is that getting converted? The way it is getting converted is through this starter, Spring Boot Starter JSON. You'd want to run the application in Tomcat. This is a starter which enables that. You'd want to build the REST API or the web application using the Spring MVC framework. These are the dependencies which enable us to do that. As you can see in here, Spring Boot Starter Web enables you to quickly get started with developing your web applications or REST API. There are also other starters which are available. If you want to talk to database, if you want to use JPA or Hibernate, in those kind of situations, you can use Spring Boot Starter Data JPA. If you want to talk to database using JDBC, you can use Spring Boot Starter JDBC. If you want to secure your web application or REST API, you can use Spring Boot Starter Security. There are a lot of starters which are available. The best way to search for starters is by going in here and saying add dependencies. If I would want to use JPA, Spring Data JPA, that's one of the starters which is provided. If you want to play with Spring Security, so Spring Security, that's one of the starters which is provided by Spring Boot. If you're new to developing enterprise applications, then words like JPA or JDBC or security might sound a little new. The important thing for you to understand is that if you want to develop any application quickly, you can just add in a starter and you'd be able to get started with that specific project. As we saw in Spring Boot Starter Web, each starter manages a list of Maven dependencies and the versions for different kinds of applications. We saw the example for web application, which is Spring Boot Starter Web. You can see a list of dependencies and their versions. All these are automatically managed by the Spring Boot Starter Web. So Spring Boot Starter Web contains the frameworks which are typically needed by your web applications. So Spring Web MVC, Spring Web, Spring Boot Starter Tomcat, or Spring Boot Starter JSON. In this step, we started demystifying some of the magic behind Spring Boot. If you use starters, you don't need to really configure all the frameworks that are typically used to develop your specific application. You can just configure a simple starter in your pom.xml, and that's it. You get all the dependencies for free. But you might be wondering, is it sufficient if I just bring in the dependencies? Don't we need to configure them? Who does that? That's what we'll be looking at in the next step. Welcome back. In this step, let's look at Spring Boot auto configuration. Spring Boot starter projects define a set of dependencies. If I need to develop a web application, I need A, B, C, D, and E. So the starter defines A, B, C, D, and E. But these frameworks might need a lot of configuration. If you want to start a Spring application, you would want to launch up an application context. You would need a lot of configuration. Who provides all that configuration? That's where Spring Boot auto configuration comes into picture. Spring Boot provides the basic configuration that is needed to run your application using the frameworks defined in your Maven dependencies. Once we added in these starters, we would have a number of frameworks or number of classes that are available in our class path. So this is where we have a lot of jars, and these jars contain a lot of classes. And what Spring Boot does is, based on these classes which are available on the class path, it would provide auto configuration. So auto configuration is decided based on which frameworks or which classes are in the class path and what is the existing configuration. You might provide additional configuration on top of the auto configuration. Spring provides auto configuration. You can override with your own configuration as well. So Spring Boot auto configuration looks at these two things: what classes are available in the class path and what configuration have you provided. And it will use this information to provide its own auto configuration. Where is all the auto configuration logic defined? All the auto configuration logic is defined in a jar called Spring Boot auto configure. So this has a lot of classes, and all these classes are responsible for auto configuration. Now, you want to look at what's happening behind auto configuration. How can you do that? What is being auto configured? I would want to find that out. How do you do that? I'll go to application.properties. So I'm opening up application.properties, which is present in here, source main resources, application.properties. And I would say logging.level.org.spring framework is equal to debug. We are setting the logging level to debug. I would stop the application and start it up. So this would print a lot more information into the log. You can see that there is a lot of debug log which is being printed. And you would see that there is a lot of auto configuration which is being done. You can see there are positive matches for auto configuration and there are negative matches for auto configuration. Let's pick up one of them. Let's pick up dispatcher servlet auto configuration. I'll open the type. So Control Shift T or Command Shift T. You can open the type up and you can look at the details behind that. So if you go to dispatcher servlet auto configuration, the important things in here are this is enabled only if it's a web application. So only if it's a web application, I would want to create a dispatcher servlet auto configuration. And this is conditional on class. An additional condition. So this is first condition. This is the second condition. What is the second condition? Dispatcher servlet.class should be available on the class path. What is defined in Spring Boot auto configuration jar is the conditions under which a specific auto configuration is applied. And when we are starting our application up, Spring Boot would look at all the classes which are available, and based on the classes and the configuration that is available, it would auto configure a lot of things. For whichever things the conditions matched, they are called positive matches. So you can see that for dispatcher servlet auto configuration, it matched. So the conditional class, which is dispatcher servlet, it was found on the class path. It's also a web application. So that's why this is auto configured. Similar to that, you'd see that there are a lot of other things which are auto configured. You can see that because this is a web application, something called an error MVC auto configuration is enabled. As we looked right now, when we are using Spring Boot Starter Web, the following details are auto configured. We saw dispatcher servlet auto configuration. You'd see that an embedded servlet container is also auto configured. We want to use Tomcat to run our web application. This is auto configured by default when we are using Spring Boot Starter Web. There are also default error pages which are auto configured. So if you search for error MVC auto configuration and search for it, you'd see that there is default error configuration that is provided. What is the use of that? Let's say I type in an error URL. Let's type in a URL, something like this, which is not defined in the application. You'd want to return some nice error to the user. And that is the requirement which is typically present in every application. And that's the reason why Spring Boot auto configures it. It automatically returns a 404. It says, this is not found. This URL does not exist on the application. So what we are returning back is a proper error message to the user. So this is an example of something which is auto configured by Spring Boot for you. The other thing which we also saw when we built our application is the bean to JSON conversion. In our course controller.java, we are returning a Java bean back, a array list back. Who's converting this to JSON? This is converted by a framework called Jackson. And this is auto-configured for us. So the two most important parts of the magic behind Spring Boot is Spring Boot starter projects and Spring Boot auto-configuration. Spring Boot starter projects define the different dependencies that are needed to build different kinds of applications. And Spring Boot auto-configuration would look at those dependencies, would look at all the classes which are available, and it would provide auto-configuration that is typically needed with that kind of application. If I'm developing a web application, I would want to configure a servlet. I would want to configure a server where I would want to run the application in. I would want to configure default error pages. I would want to configure to and fro conversion from JSON. All that configuration is automatically done so that you focus on your business logic. The end objective of Spring Boot is to help you focus on the application you are building, not worry about the frameworks or the configuration that is needed by the frameworks. I'm sure you're having a wonderful time, and I'll see you in the next step. Welcome back. In this step, let's further understand what's happening behind our Spring Boot application. If you open up the Learn Spring Boot application class, you'd see that this is where this Spring context is being launched up. This is being launched up by using Spring application.run. And this would launch up this class, the configuration which is present in this class, as a Spring context. If you open up Spring Boot application, you would see that there are three important annotations which are present in here. I'll copy these out and paste them in here. So the annotations which are present in here are Spring Boot configuration, at enable auto configuration, and also an important one called component scan. Spring Boot configuration identifies that this is a configuration file. This indicates that this is a class which provides Spring Boot application configuration. Typically in Spring Framework, if you are defining your own configuration, you can put @configuration on top of it. And for Spring Boot applications, the annotation is Spring Boot configuration. The next thing is to enable auto configuration. We saw auto configuration in action in the last step. By default, every kind of auto configuration is enabled. However, if the auto configuration with Spring Boot does not match your requirements, you can go and disable specific kinds of auto configuration as well. You can go in here, you can go to @enable configuration, and you'd see that you can exclude certain classes. So you can exclude specific auto configuration classes that should not be applied. So if you go further down, you can see that there are a lot of auto configuration files. If you don't want to use certain auto configuration files, you can exclude them. So if you're not happy with the default auto configuration which is provided, you can exclude it and you can provide your own configuration as well. The third important thing is a very important feature of the Spring Framework. Using component scan, you can specify the packages where the Spring Framework can scan for different kinds of components. So you can specify a package like this, and Spring Framework would search this package for components or beans it would want to manage. By default, the component scan which is done by Spring Boot would be done on this specific package. So com.in 28 minutes that learn Spring Boot is the package on which the component scan will be done on. Let's organize imports in here. And what I would recommend you to do is to actually build one more method in here as an exercise. What I would want to do is, for now, build another method which would have the URL courses/1. So http://localhost:8080/courses/1. And what I would want to return is just one course back. Over here, we are returning a list of courses back. So I can say Control-C and add another course. So let's say I would want to add another course because we are sending a list back. You can have multiple thing back. So let's say I would want to learn full stack with Angular and React. So that's what I would want to do. I can save this. And you'd see that if you stop and restart the server, this would return 2 elements back. However, what I would want to do is return just one element back. We want to return this specific course directly as part of this exercise. You can pause the video and try that as an exercise. Now, the way we can do that is I would just copy and paste this in. I'm a little lazy, so let's take the lazy approach. So /courses, what we want to do is to do /courses.1. And what we want to do is to get a specific course. So get course details, and let's return just one thing back. Let's return the one with the details back. I need to change the return type. So it's not a list of course, it's directly the course. And I would stop and start the application. And you should see your new service up and running. So it's a debug level, so a lot of log. And if I go to courses, I can see the courses/1. Cool. It returns this specific thing back. Right now, we have not implemented other things like courses/2 or courses/3. For that, we need to make use of a few other Spring MVC concepts like path variables. Let's not worry about them for now. For now, the important thing for us to understand is Spring Boot makes it very, very easy to build any kind of application that you would want to build. It helps you to focus on your business logic, and you don't really need to worry about any other configuration that is typically needed. Let's see a lot more about Spring Boot in the subsequent steps. I'll see you in the next step. Welcome back. In this step, let's talk about embedded servers. If you go a few years back, the way you deploy your application is first you would install Java, and then you would install a web server or an application server. There are a number of web servers or application servers which are available like Tomcat, WebLogic, or WebSphere. And if I would want to install a Java application or a var file on the web server, I would need to first install Java and then install the web server. And only after that, I can go ahead and install my application var. So to run a web application a few years back, you needed to install Java and install a web server on an application server, and then you would go ahead and deploy the application. So you'd see that there are a lot of complex steps which are involved. So running Java applications a few years back was very complex. However, compared to that, running other applications, for example, Node.js applications, was very, very simple. Spring Boot makes running your Java applications very easy. How does it do it? Through the concept of embedded server. When you're using embedded server, all that you need to do is to install Java, and then you can go ahead and run your jar file. How is this possible? This is possible because your jar file contains the server inbuilt. Your jar file contains the embedded server. In the example that we have been running until now, the jar file contains Tomcat right inside the jar file. And therefore, you only need Java installed. You have the jar file. If you have Java installed, that's more than sufficient to go ahead and run the jar file. Let's see that in action right now. Let's build a jar file. How can I build a jar file for this particular project? The way you can do that is by going in here, right click, run as Maven build, and I would say the goal as install. I'll say clean space install and say run. So this would do a mvn clean install and it would build this specific jar. The first time we are building a jar, it does take a long time. So there are a lot of steps in building the jar. All of them are provided by default for you. And you can see that a jar is automatically created for us. You can see that a jar is created in this specific path. You can see that installing this specific thing. So if you go to the command line and pick up this particular folder, so you'd see that there is a target folder which is at the end. So I'll pick that up. So if you do to cd to that folder and do a ls, you'd see that there is a jar file which is present in here. So learn Spring Boot 0.0.1 snapshot.jar. So this jar is created for us, and this jar automatically contains Tomcat. And so to run this, all that I need to do is to say java-jar and paste that in. Learn Spring Boot 0.0.1 snapshot.jar. And you'd see that the application would launch up automatically. You can see that the application start has failed because port 8080 is already in use. I have this application running here. So let's kill this. So let's kill the application and make sure that we don't have anything running in here. And you can go in and execute the command again, java-jar. So that's basically how you can run your jar files. And you can see that the application is up and running. And you'd be able to easily go in and execute the URLs that you would want to execute. As we saw earlier, the Tomcat is coming in because of Spring Boot Starter Web. So if you go to Spring Boot Starter Web and click open pom.xml for this, so control click and select this, you'd see that over here we have Spring Boot Starter Tomcat. This is the starter which brings in Tomcat. So Tomcat would be built into our jar, and that is what it would be used to launch up our application. Josh Long is one of the popular Spring developer advocates, and one of the statements that he made that I really love is make jar and not var. Jars make it really, really easy to run your applications. So make jar and not var. The embedded server we have been using until now is Tomcat. If you want to use other embedded servers, there are starters for them as well. Spring Boot Starter Jetty is for Jetty. Spring Boot Starter Undertow is Undertow. In this step, we understood the concept of embedded servers. We understood why we need to make jar and not var. Welcome back. Starting this step, let's explore a few more Spring Boot features. Let's start with Spring Boot Actuator. One of the important goals of Spring Boot is to help you build production-ready applications very easily. One of the typical needs in production is to be able to monitor your application, to be able to look at the metrics behind your application. And one of the options Spring Boot provides for you to be able to easily manage your application in production is Spring Boot Actuator. Spring Boot Actuator provides you with a number of endpoints. You can look at all the list of Spring Beans in your application. You can look at the application health information. You can look at the different metrics behind the application. And you can also look at the different request mappings you have as part of your application. Let's look at this in action right now. So how do I get started with Spring Boot Actuator? All that I need to do is copy this and paste it in and say Spring Boot Starter Actuator. So similar to Spring Boot Starter Web, we have Spring Boot Starter Actuator. Let me stop the jar file I'm running in here. So I don't really want to run it as a jar anymore. I'll do a Control-C to shut down that. And I'll go back to running it from here. So we added the actuator to our maven pom.xml. it would automatically download the jars for us and it would make them available to the application, and I can go ahead and run this. So let's go ahead and launch it up. Learn Spring Boot application is what we would want to launch it up. The console is, the application is launched up, and the URL for Actuator is localhost 8080/Actuator. And you can see that by default, Actuator provides 3 different URLs. As I said earlier, I have a plugin called JSON Viewer which is installed. This is a response which is typically written back from Actuator, and the JSON Viewer makes it available in this specific way. So it's formatting it so that I can easily invoke the URLs and things like that. If you want, you can go ahead and install the JSON Viewer Chrome plugin as well. Now you can go in here if you want to find out the health of the application. You can see that the application is up and running. If you want to see any information behind the Actuator, actually this does not really return anything back. If you open that up, you'd see an empty thing back. But this is one of the APIs which are provided by Actuator. As you can see in here, by default, only a few APIs are enabled. But there are a lot more things that you can enable on your Actuator. The way you can enable them is by going to application.properties. So source main resources, application.properties. So in source main resources, we have the application.properties. What I would do is I would turn off the debug logging. There's too much log coming in. So let's turn that off, and let's add in a simple configuration to enable all Actuator endpoints. Actuator is related to management. We would want to manage our application. And what we want to do is to enable all the endpoints. That's what we are doing in here. Management.endpoints.web.exposure.include is equal to star. Once you add this and you stop and start the server, let's start it again. And if you go and refresh the Actuator URL, you'd see that there are a lot more URLs which are present in here. So you can go ahead and say Actuator beans, and this would show all the Spring beans which are created. So we have created a controller, and for this there would be a Spring bean which would be created. So if you search for course controller, you should see a Spring bean which is created for you. I'll close this. I'll close the other ones as well and go back to Actuator. You can see the health information. You can see details about the environment as well. So if you go to env URL, you can see the details. I'm running the server on port 8080. And you can also see the Java version which is being made use of, what is the class path, and a lot of details about the environment where the application is running in. You can also get a lot of metrics. So Actuator metrics, and you can see a lot of metrics related to the application which is running. Let's pick up one of these metrics from here. Let's say I would want to find out how many requests have come in until now. I can go to HTTP server requests. So metrics/HTTP server requests, and this would show me how many requests have come in. Right now it's saying 5 requests. And if you execute a few more requests, I'll refresh the Actuator URL again and refresh the HTTP server requests. You can see that there are more requests. So there are now 9 requests. So you can look at the metrics related to different things using Actuator as well. One of the important recommendations that I have for you is to enable only the things that you would make use of. Right now we are doing a star. This would enable everything. However, you always have the option of enabling specific things that you would want to use only. So for example, if you'd want to expose, let's say, only the health information, I can put health in here. And if you want to, let's say, also expose the metrics, so I can copy metrics in here and say metrics. So this would help you to configure and enable specific URLs only. And now if you stop and start, let's go ahead and start this up and refresh Actuator. You'd see that only health and metrics are now enabled. In this step, we played around with Spring Boot Actuator. I'll see you in the next step. Welcome back. In this step, let's play around with one of my favorite features in Spring Boot. This is called Spring Boot DevTools. Let's see what features it would bring in. Spring Boot DevTools increases developer productivity. Think about this. Why do we need to restart the server for every code change? So over here, I would go in and add in a dependency. Org Spring Framework boot, Spring Boot, DevTools. One of the important things about DevTools is it's not useful in production. You are not going to go and make code changes directly in production. So that's the reason why you don't want it to be part of your deployable unit. The way you can do that is by saying scope as runtime. And I would go ahead and say save. What is the magic that it would enable? Before we can see the magic, for one time alone, we have to stop so that it would actually pick up the dependencies and then click start again. So this would start the application up and this would return back. And if I look at the course controller, what is the details that are retrieved by courses/1 right now? If I invoke courses/1, ID is 1, learn microservices in 28 minutes. Let's say I would want to change this. I want to add learn microservices 1 and save this. What would happen now? You can see that the server is automatically restarted. So it automatically picks up the change. And if you refresh, you'd see that the details are automatically picked up. So the important thing for you is that you don't really need to keep restarting the server each time. Whenever you're making a code change in your Java files, as soon as you make the code change, the change would be picked up by the server and you can directly run your URLs and check if your change is working. That's the magic of DevTools. Now, a warning, if you change pom.xml, if you add a new dependency in pom.xml or something like that, or if you are removing a dependency from pom.xml, DevTools will not be able to pick that up. What you need to do is to stop and start the server every time you make a change in pom.xml. However, any Java changes you make, any changes you make to your Spring components, all those changes will be automatically picked up by DevTools. That is one very important thing to remember. A lot of times I see questions where students go and add a dependency into the pom.xml and you would not see it reflect immediately. The reason is because if you make a change in the pom.xml, for it to reflect, even if you are using DevTools, you need to stop and start the application. In this step, we looked at Spring Boot DevTools. It helps you increase your productivity and save a lot of time. I'm sure you're having a wonderful time and I'll see you in the next step. Welcome back. Whenever we talk about Spring Framework or Spring MVC or Spring Boot, you'd see that there are a lot of frameworks available. And you are often confused, what is the role of which one? What is the role of Spring Boot? What is the role of Spring MVC? And what is the role of Spring Framework? The idea behind this step is to give you a little bit more clarity into what these frameworks are all about. The core feature of Spring Framework is dependency injection. You'd want to define your beans and auto-wire your dependencies. That's the most important feature of the Spring Framework. So things like add component, add auto-wired, IOC container, application context, component scan. These are all the things that Spring Framework enables. Spring also provides a number of modules and a number of projects. So if you want to develop a web application, it provides a Spring Web MVC module. If you don't want to configure a lot of things and quickly build projects, it provides a project called Spring Boot. So Spring MVC is a Spring module. It's a Spring module which helps you to build web applications in a decoupled approach. So Spring MVC is all about dispatcher servlet, model and view, view resolver. Whenever you're building a web application with Spring MVC, you need to configure a lot of things. And that's the problem that Spring Boot aims to solve. It helps you to build production-ready applications quickly. With Spring Boot, you don't really need to manually configure any of these. As soon as you add in Spring Web Starter, all these things are auto-configured for you. So you don't really need to worry about how to configure a framework. You can start building your business logic. So Spring Boot provides a number of starter projects which make it easy to build a variety of applications. And it provides auto configuration so that you don't really need to manually set up a lot of things when you're creating a new project. Spring Boot also provides you with a number of production-ready non-functional features. It provides something like Actuator, which makes it easy to monitor your applications. It also provides features like embedded servers. You don't really need to worry about installing Java, then installing a web server, and then running your application. Because Tomcat or embedded Tomcat is already part of your jar, you can directly install Java and directly run your application. It also provides you features like default error handling. When you execute a non-existing URL, it would give you a proper error message. Spring Framework is all about dependency injection. Spring MVC is a Spring module which helps you to build web applications. But when you use Spring MVC, there is a lot of configuration that is needed. Spring Boot helps you to avoid that configuration. It helps you to build applications quickly. Spring Boot makes it easy to build your applications through starter projects and auto configuration. I'm sure you're having an interesting time, and I'll see you in the next step. Welcome back. The goal of this section was to provide you with a 10,000 feet overview of the Spring Boot framework. We were focused on helping you understand the terminology in a hands-on way. We played with a few starter projects, and we also looked at auto configuration. We also understood the use of Actuator and DevTools. The biggest advantage of Spring Boot is that it helps you get started quickly with developing your applications. You don't need to worry about a lot of configuration. You just add in a few starter projects and you can immediately start focusing on your business logic. It also provides you a number of production-ready, non-functional features. I'm sure you had an exciting time in this specific section, and I'll see you in the next section.